So good morning, everybody. So I wanted to sort of start situating the research that I'm doing by remembering this conversation that I had once with a doctor friend of mine, who was explaining to me how it's important to study disease, um, because it can reveal aspects of how our bodies work that are not evident, that are not apparent when we are studying a healthy body. And so I think that what I'm trying to do is taking this opportunity that COVID has somewhat opened up to understand, to study a system and to understand a system as it undergoes a crisis, with the idea that watching our reaction during a crisis is going to offer insights that are not obvious when the system is functioning as it's meant to. And so clearly, a crisis is what we have today. The whole world is on halt, and I think that this reveals a lot of insights about vulnerability and like the built-in vulnerabilities that we have in our social and ecological and technological systems. So if we go to the heuristic that sort of sums up resilience, which is the adaptive cycle that was put out by Holland. I don't have a lot of time, but I think that I just want to say that, we usually have systems that start on the lower left quadrant. So, like at that point, systems are very nimble, and then they start to consolidate it and they start to move towards the conservation phase, which is a system that is usually very highly performant, but over a very reduced range of conditions. And then, you have a crisis, you have a shock that sends the system off into the release phase and a reorganization phase. And you can see this in social and ecological and technological systems. And, in case you're wondering, we are exactly at that point where our system has suffered a shock. And so we are in this sort of scrambling phase, reorganization phase. And I think that these are rare, happily, these are rare episodes where systems are in total disarray, but it does show you what mechanisms are enacted at that point. And I think like that's the part that I'm interested in looking. And so when we talk about resilience, and I'm talking, and I do realize that I'm going very theoretical here, but anyways, that's where I am. So I think like when we talk about resilience, these are the mechanisms that, or the principles that we think build resilience. And so I'm going to go very briefly over them and explain how I'm testing that, or what I'm trying to do with this. So I think that, there's the idea of diversity, and diversity really is just like the principle of like not putting all your eggs in one basket. If you don't do that, then you're building resilience in the system because you have more options to turn to. There's the idea of redundancy. So having redundancy in the components of the system means that you have things in the system that offer similar functions, but they're different. So if you think of a hotel and a hospital, what do those two things have in common? They have rooms. So in a crisis like COVID, you can use the rooms to house, like once you are running out of hospital bedrooms, in some cities they have use hotel bedrooms to host people who are sick. The idea of connectivity, which is like the main thing that, like the main directive is around managing connectivity. So keep people isolating, but and then that raises other issues around, well, how do we maintain social connection? Because that also is known to help people go through a crisis. And here, when we talk about connectivity, we can also think about social, ecological, and technological connectivity. Keeping an eye on slow variables, and the best way that I can explain a slow variable is thinking of things that sneak up. So if you're looking at the sea and you're looking at the waves, the tide is a slow variable, and oftentimes resilience has to do with the tide, with things that are moving slowly in the system, but that really shape how the system works. And like, what does that look like in real life? Values is usually a slow variable, and you can see how values are playing really interesting roles in like how people are reacting to the crisis. Like I'm talking politics. feedbacks. I think controlling feedbacks is key to the resilience of a system. And you can, in this particular case, you can see how, you know, people start to panic buy, and that means that then, you know, there's like empty shelves, there is a perception that there's a scarcity, and because there's that perception, then they go and panic buy some more. And so you are creating this like positive, and by positive I mean a reinforcing feedback loop. And maintaining resilience has to do in a lot of ways with managing those feedbacks, right? I think that keeping a systems lens, so understanding that when we're dealing with resilience, we're often talking about complex adaptive systems. So there's going to be certain degree of uncertainty, of things that we do not control, of nonlinear effects that are difficult to predict and to manage. I think that, again, it's important to maintain, so to keep in mind that we're talking about interlinked systems. So you have social, ecological, and technological elements, and they're all interacting. And finally, the idea that any of our, from a resilience perspective, you have the idea of scales. And so I developed this one for dengue, but it kind of is applicable to many diseases. So the idea is like you might have an outbreak of dengue or whatever zoonotic disease, and like that would have, you know, some sort of temporal and spatial scale at which it happens. But it really, that outbreak is affected by things that happen at a smaller scale. So like if you can think of dengue and you have mosquitoes that are the carriers, mosquitoes live in a much, you know, like only for, you know, a few days to a month. You can have puddles where mosquitoes are actually, you know, lay their eggs, and those puddles, like on the street, they might, you know, be very ephemeral. At the same time, you can have other things that are happening at higher scales, like climate change. And climate change is going to impact, you know, the frequency of rain. And that means it's going to impact the mosquito cycles, and that's going to impact the disease. So like, so this is for dengue, but you can think of any disease and any crisis and realize that there's going to be phenomena that happens at a smaller scales and at larger scales that are interacting and shaping one another. And it's important to keep that in mind. The idea that learning and experimentation helps with resilience. And here, you know, like I think resilience, like the best that it's done in terms of getting something practical has been through trying to implement adaptive management. And this has been, you know, like very, well, it hasn't, we're not doing adaptive management widely, and there's reasons why, we can talk about those. But the idea is that when you manage a system, you're trying to learn by doing. So there's like constant experimentation. You propose policies with the idea that these are hypotheses, and you set up experiments to actually learn about the system that as you're managing it. And so there's a lot of iteration. And of course, this is not necessarily palatable for cities. Participation, and here, you know, there's like pragmatic reasons and there's philosophical reasons for doing participatory work, or participatory budgeting, or participatory governance. The idea here is that, you know, doing that builds resilience. And finally, polycentricity is another one of the principles that is supposed to build resilience. And polycentricity means having semi-autonomous centers that are able to take decisions. So, you know, when you have a lot of, so decentralized decision-making centers is supposed to build resilience. And so the issue here is that we have these principles, and, you know, we can talk about them a lot, but we do not actually have a lot of evidence, or we have uneven evidence in terms of, are they really building resilience? And so the question, excuse me. So the question that I'm trying to get at is, how are these principles of resilience playing out during the current crisis, or are they? Or are there other principles that are not in this list that is actually what people are doing? And the way that I'm going about this, so I was invited to be part of the Resilience Alliance, which is a group, a network of international scholars and just practitioners, but mostly scholars, that operates worldwide and that thinks about resilience and creates a theory of resilience and whatnot. And so we have nodes in the States, Canada, Sweden, parts of Europe, South Africa, and Australia. Those are the strongest nodes, but there's connection to other places worldwide. And so I've run the idea with them of running a survey. And so right now the Resilience Alliance might be about 50 members, but the networks are larger. So hopefully we can get to maybe like 100 people, 100 experts on resilience, to take a survey and really the survey wants to do two things. One is asking people to document adaptive or coping responses that they have observed. Hopefully if we have about 100 respondents, we can have, say like if each of them suggests 2 or 3 observations, we can have quite a bit of a large database of adaptive mechanisms that have been deployed during the current crisis, and then ask them to try to figure out, okay, well, when we're talking about, like using hotels for beds, like what principles are we really enacting? And so that's the principle of redundancy. And so having them go through that. And so the idea that, so the deliverables here will be this scan and classification of, like 100 plus adaptation or coping mechanisms for COVID worldwide. Hopefully that is, because we're talking at the systems level, I think that is translatable to other crises. And so, it's in that sort of abstract sense that I'm proposing this research. Then within the Resilience Alliance, I mean, I would like to think of a working group, but it's not clear, but at least we can have conversations, we can have panels with other resilient thinkers. Definitely when we go back to scheduling the regular resilience conference, this will be something that we'll propose to explore further there, as well as a manuscript for Ecology and Society, which is the flagship of the flagship journal of the Resilience Alliance. In terms of the, well, so what, I think that what my research is trying to do is to advance theory in terms of resilience and vulnerability, with the idea of that in doing so, we can advance our readiness for the next crisis. Also understanding that the next crisis, might not be a health crisis, it could be a hurricane, it could be, there's many, could be an economic downturn. And so the idea here will be to advance other crises. And as well, I think that we need to increase conceptual clarity. I think that, at this point we have entire, schools, initiatives, programs, city officers of resilience, and we are not very clear about what resilience actually means. And I think that, this will be a contribution towards having some more clarity of not what resilience is, but like, how does it look like on the ground? With that, I just want to acknowledge my co-conspirators. So that's Mike Schoen from the School of Sustainability, Elena Bennett from McGill University, and Gary Peterson from the Stockholm Resilience Center. And this is the team that is leading the survey with the Resilience Alliance. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marta. Let's see. There's one question, sorry, on the chat. Julia, did you want to ask her your question, or I'm sorry, it was just a comment?
Oh yeah.
I think it's amazing. It's so far beyond like what I could ever do, but I am very excited. Hope we can kind of see the results of what come from your project, because I think that's really neat.
Thank you. I mean, yes, I think that there's like maybe I'm excited to ask these people because they think about resilience a lot. So I'm quite, I'm excited, and because I'm a little bit of a nerd in that way, I think it's fun. There is also, the possibility of doing like a bit, maybe like a spin-off where we actually ask people, like we deploy the survey to regular people, to civilians, and to, but like the issue is that because it's so abstract, we're not going to be able to ask people, well, does this improve connectivity? But we can think of like, and so that was the slide that you saw at the end. Is so like this idea of like, maybe we can translate it into proxies that, like we can check for connectivity. Like, like we can ask people, where is your next of kin located at? And so like, we can use that to qualify their responses. So, but that is also, I didn't want to promise that because it's not entirely, I'm not certain how that would happen. So yeah, so I'm keeping it a little bit theoretical at this point. Whose resilience I'm talking about? Yes, I think that. So I've been kind of leaving things very open because I talk about the system and whatnot. I think that here we're talking about it would depend. And so like the actual questionnaire, it asks, you know, like what is the intervention that you're seeing, at what scale does it happen? So we can have things that are happening at the household level or individual level. We can have things that are happening at the city level. And so like that's one of the questions that we ask people to identify. And it's a bit difficult because when you think of like, you know, wearing protective equipment, where does the directive come from? You know, you have individual, you can have city, you have businesses. So I think it's going to be ambiguous, but we ask people to identify, and that would be relevant to each of the interventions.